I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I was probably around 8 or 9, and I had this idea on a weekend that I wanted to build a model airplane. And I had a good idea in my mind of what it would look like, and I was fairly confident that I could make it fly. And I went into our backyard, and I went into my dad's toolbox, and I pulled out the tools that I thought I would need, some nails and a hammer and a handsaw and a screwdriver. And I found some old pieces of wood that were lying around, and I pulled everything out, and I set it out on the ground, and I looked at it. And at that point, I realized that I had no idea of how to go about making an airplane. I had a vision of it in my mind, but I realized then that I was lacking not only the tools, but the materials. That didn't stop me from trying. The basic shape of an airplane. So I took one piece of old wood and got another piece of old wood, and I kind of laid one across the other and hammered it to it, and that was my airplane. It looked more like a misshapen cross than an airplane, and it flew. It flew from here to here. I had no idea. I had no idea how to actually fashion it and form it. When we hear the word Sabbath, I think that conjures up for all of us in our minds a particular idea. And it might actually be a pleasant idea for some of you. For others of us, it may be something heavy or something legalistic or something boring. But regardless, when we actually come to the practical issues of observing the Sabbath, we don't really know what we're doing or how to go about it. Last week, as we continue our progression through the book of Exodus, in dealing with this fourth commandment in Exodus chapter 20, to keep the Sabbath, we answered the question, what is the Sabbath? What was it intended to be? And we talked about it being a rhythm, a break, a difference, a blessing, and a communion. Today we want to look at the more practical questions of how we may observe the Sabbath and why we should observe the Sabbath. Now, just as a review, I believe that there is sufficient scriptural evidence to support that the command to observe the Sabbath is not at the same level as the other 9 commands for New Testament life. That doesn't mean that it's not valid. It doesn't mean that it's not wise for us to obey it. But because of Paul's additions or his suggestions that we should not allow anyone to judge us on the keeping or not of the Sabbath, and because of his admonition that we are not to consider someone's spirituality based on whether they observe one day as holy as opposed to treating all days alike, we understand that the Sabbath remains, though today now, an invitation. It is an invitation to blessing. It is an invitation to communion. It is an invitation that God has extended to his people to be with him and to rest. The idea is that as we look at practical aspects of the Sabbath, that we might actually begin to make it a regular practice. Responding to this loving invitation from God to rest and to be restored on a regular basis. I'll begin by reading this command again from Exodus chapter 20. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So how was the Sabbath to be observed? Number 1, by keeping it holy. That's how the command begins. Remember the Sabbath day That's the primal command. And then the first answer to how? By keeping it holy. Now, we've discussed before the meaning of the word holy. It means to be set apart for a specific purpose. We've also talked about the difference between our modern Western understanding of the idea of being set apart. For us today, something set apart is something to the side. It's something peripheral. But in the Jewish Hebrew understanding, to be holy, to be set apart, meant to be central. To be right at the middle. So remember the Sabbath day by keeping it central, by keeping it a priority. In the middle of your vision, in the middle of your life, in the middle of your rhythms. Not off to the side, not peripheral, but integral and central. And note how the command here is bookended by this idea of holiness, of centrality. The command begins, how? Remember the Sabbath day? To keep it holy. So that's the command, keep it holy. And then how does the command end? God blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Holiness is on both ends. It's at the beginning and it's at the end. In other words, keep the Sabbath by keeping it. Keep the Sabbath by keeping it central, by keeping it as part of your life focus. How far we've fallen from that ideal, haven't we? And just as a rhetorical question, answer this for yourself. Is the Sabbath central to you? The second way in which we should keep the Sabbath is by working. Wait, that's wrong. The whole point of the Sabbath is to rest, right? But did you listen to that whole command? Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. What's the next part? 6 days you shall labor. That's part of the command. That's prescriptive. That is God saying this is what you should do. You should keep the Sabbath holy. You should keep it central. And you should work 6 other days. Now, what does this have to do? What does working have to do with keeping the Sabbath? Today, many of us live a different reality than what the ancient Jews lived. Actually, we all live a different reality than what the ancient Jews lived, but in the concept of how many days a week we work. So there are some of you who do work 6 days a week. At your job, you work 6 days a week and you have a floating day off or a floating folga. But for many of you, many of us, I should say, we work 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And this is what I mean by working being part of keeping the Sabbath. Now, in ancient Judaism, we know that the Sabbath was Saturday. That's our day of the week to which it would have corresponded. It's on Saturday. Now, as with the Apostle Paul, today, I don't think the actual day of the week chosen to observe the Sabbath is crucial. But I would suggest that the most likely one for us is Sunday. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But let's work from the perspective of Sunday as Sabbath. That would mean that our perspective on Saturday needs to change. Saturday we should see as a work day. It's one of the 6. A day to accomplish all the things that we couldn't do Monday through Friday of the work week. Upkeep at home, shopping, running errands, homework. And I have kids that this affects, right? I mean, how often, students, do you spend Sunday doing homework? Now, if you spent all day Saturday and all Saturday night doing homework and you still had some homework left to do on Sunday, okay, that's fine. But given that I have kids, I know that's not usually what happens. Given that I have my whole life tended toward procrastination, I also know that when the weekend comes and you get out of school on Friday, suddenly you're looking at it, it's like, I've got all weekend. And how quickly does that weekend boil down to Sunday night? Right? And it's all evaporated away. And then all the homework is there left on Sunday night. Because in order to keep the Sabbath, we must work. We have to. If the Sabbath is central and we keep it central, then that means that Saturday needs to serve Sunday. It actually means that all the other 6 days of the week need to serve your Sabbath rather than the other way around. So to be more general, whichever day is your Sabbath, the other days of the week we should treat as work days. That should be our perspective on it. Working diligently so that when we arrive at the Sabbath, we are free to observe it and to actually rest. This is a positive command from the heart and mind of God. 6 days you shall work. That's part of the seventh day being a Sabbath. Thirdly, we keep the Sabbath by planning for the Sabbath. This goes along with the idea of working 6 days. Because, friends, we are never going to be able to keep the Sabbath and enjoy its fruits if we don't intentionally plan to keep it. Because I don't know how things work in your mind or in your heart or in your home. But I know that for me, if I just have a vague idea, oh yeah, on Sunday afternoon, I'm just going to rest. Never happens. If it's just vague, it never happens. Because there's always stuff to do. So when I talk about planning for the Sabbath, it means we plan the food ahead of time. Doesn't mean we have to prepare all the food ahead of time, but we already know what we're going to eat. We know and we have it already at home. We have the raw materials for our meals already at home. That we've already done our shopping. As I said earlier, that we've finished our homework, that our calendar is clear. So we need to think through the needs of that day and what we must do in order to meet those needs. If God is our focus on the Sabbath, then we should honor him by diligently and intentionally preparing. Imagine if you were to go, for those of you who are married, imagine that you're going on a date with your spouse. For those of you who are not married, imagine that you're going on a date with someone that you are very interested in. And all throughout the date, the person spends most of their time on their cell phone. Now, if that's your husband, you can deal with that in a very direct way, right? And likewise, if that's your wife, enough. But if you're not yet married, that could be very awkward, and it communicates something, doesn't it? And this is something that all of us are prone to. It communicates that whoever is on the other side of that device is more important than you. And whatever they have to say at that moment is more important than what you have to say. And so if we are not intentional about planning for the Sabbath, then that day that's intended to be restful and restorative and worshipful, we're going to be constantly going off in other directions. And this concept of planning includes the concept of when the Sabbath begins. For the Jews, God was really clear. The Sabbath is from sundown to sundown. And that's important. It's actually interesting, brothers and sisters, that even in the account of creation, when God is describing the days, he talks about, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. That's not normally the way we think, is it? There was morning and there was evening is what we would say. Why do you imagine that God had his people begin his Sabbath on the evening of the previous day? It's because God knows us so well. He knows us so well because, and I would suggest that this applies, generally speaking, to the younger you are, but it applies to all of us. Any night or evening when we don't have work the next day, we treat that as a party night, don't we? Christina does anyway. we treat that as a party night. We do, it's like, woohoo! And I remember even as a kid, even as today, when there's a holiday the next day, isn't the evening before a holiday fun? It's just like, yes, and what is our attitude? Don't have to go to bed early. I don't have to do any work. I don't have to worry about homework because I can do that tomorrow. It's a party night. Christian parties, of course. Yeah. So let me ask you, how many of you have come to church with a Christian hangover? And what I mean by a Christian hangover, by just being way too tired. Now, there are reasons that we are tired and exhausted. I'm not suggesting that there aren't legitimate reasons for being tired in church. But if the reason is that we went to bed or didn't go to bed the night before, then we went to bed too late. And too late varies. That's why we're not into legalism. Friends, and for example, the Andersons, Hakel and Carrie and Julie and I, we have a joke between us that late to the Fawcetts does not mean the same thing as late to the Andersons. And it's not, and we're not about being legalistic about that. Friends, I'll be honest with you, 10 o'clock is really late for me. Ask my sons. I fall asleep at 9:30. I'm old. You know what? Other people are like, they're 10 o'clock, that's cedo. You know, it's early. But the point is this. Begin our Sabbath practice the evening before. That's when it starts. God invites his people to begin their rest the evening before, intentionally preparing them to be ready to enjoy the Sabbath day of rest and worship. Then, on the Sabbath, at sundown, more or less, again, we're not into being legalistic about this, but around the time that the sun's going down, you know, the day's coming to an end, then, if there is work or preparation that needs to be done for the ensuing week, you begin it then. Fourthly, how do we observe the Sabbath? By worship. It's intended to be a day of worship and communion with God. While worship may not be the only aspect of the day, together with rest, it is the priority activity. Remember the text, it tells us that this is a Sabbath to the Lord. So he is the creator, institutor, and object of the Sabbath. Now, many couples make a point of celebrating their wedding anniversary. To do so, they set apart a day, or at the very least, a meal, to be together, just the two of them, to enjoy each other and to remember their relationship. In a similar way, God gives his church the invitation to regularly, weekly, not just annually, celebrate their relationship with him. To be together with God and your brothers and sisters in Christ, to enjoy his presence, to worship him as he ministers to us. And then fifthly, you knew we would get here eventually, excuse me, rest. One reason that legalism killed or can kill the joy and blessing of the Sabbath is because, newsflash, people are different. And what is genuinely restful and restorative for one person may be exhausting and taxing for another. To be in a large group of people for an entire day may be energizing and renewing for an extrovert like myself. But for an introvert, the same experience, though it may be good, is draining. For me, going on a short, slow, those are two very important adjectives, going on a short and slow run is restorative and energizing and renewing. It is. Short and slow, that's important. But for someone else, going on even a short or slow run wears them out. So we need to be careful in how we define rest, except in ways that God defines it. So what I mean by that is we cannot make blanket statements about what is and is not restful unless God has made those statements. And so how does God define it? What does he say in this command? He says, 6 days you shall labor, but on the seventh day you shall do no work. So the ancient Jewish nation got in trouble because they felt like they had to specifically define work rather than allowing God to define it. Because even though God says there's no work on the Sabbath, yet there are some activities that require physical movement and what we might say effort that are allowed on the Sabbath. For example, preparing food. That's something that God allowed his people to do specifically. God never said that they couldn't travel That was another imposition that was made on them by the Jewish leaders in an attempt, a genuine attempt to guard and protect the Sabbath. So I suggest that when God says you shall not work, this is the criteria for us today, I believe. And you take this and you examine it before the Lord and see if this is what if you would agree with this. When God says no work, I suggest that he's saying nothing that relates to what you do for a living. Okay? So what you do for your income, whatever that may be, the Sabbath is supposed to be a day that you do not focus on that. You do not do any work that pertains to how you make your income. And secondly, I would also suggest that it has to do with the upkeep of your home. So maybe washing clothes, something we should try to avoid doing on the Sabbath, because that is work, and it's something from which we should rest. You know, cleaning the house, sending job-related emails. All of those things, I think, are things from which we should rest. And that's why, again, just to retouch on that issue of preparing for the Sabbath, it's going to be really hard to not wash clothes if all of your clothes are dirty because you haven't washed them during the week, you know? So, you know, that's a way that we have to prepare. It's going to be hard not to clean your house if the house is really, really dirty and you're about to start another week with a really dirty house because you haven't been able to do it before. Now, friends, please hear me. I'm not judging you. I'm not condemning us. Because I'm right in this with you. I am challenging us to look at the greater blessing and the greater good and the invitation to which God has called us and is offering. So those are the things from which we are to abstain in order to rest. Rest the body, rest the mind, and rest the soul. Now, rest might also refer to a location or a place. A park may be restful, while generally a cinema or a circus or an arcade is not. Remember how we have in the past discussed also the difference between entertainment and rest. They're not synonymous. There are forms of entertainment that may be restful, but just because something is entertaining does not necessarily mean that it's restful. The idea of rest on the Sabbath is an act of trust. It acknowledges that God is our provider and that ultimately all things come from Him. So when we rest from our work, from our gainful employment on the Sabbath, we're acknowledging that God is in control. And we're saying that ultimately our provision comes from Him and that He's the one that cares for us. One thing I genuinely love to see is babies and little children in general, but specifically when they're asleep in their parents' arms. I love that. And I remember with our sons when they were holdable, the joy that I received when they would fall asleep in my arms. Because it's a picture of complete trust. It's a picture of complete surrender and peace. This person is going to take care of me. And the Sabbath should be an image like that to us, of complete trust in God. I can rest. I can rest on this day because God is in control. I can rest on this day because God is sovereign. I can rest on this day because I'm in His arms. So just as quick review, 5 hows of how we would observe the Sabbath. By keeping it holy, so by keeping it central. Okay? By working on the other 6 days so that we can be prepared. Okay? Thirdly, by planning ahead and being intentional about getting ready for the Sabbath. Fourthly, in worship. Intentionally spending time worshiping the Lord on that day in His presence. And then fifthly, resting. I want to move on to our last question, which is the question why. Why should we observe the Sabbath? And the first answer to that, there are 2 that I'm going to give you today, but the first answer is simply because God did. All of the 10 Commandments are based on the activity and nature of God. He modeled the Sabbath He blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy, central, a time for him to commune with himself and rest from his labors. We are made in his image, and we are made to imitate his activity and his love. And in case you missed it, I just want you to hear this emphasis in this command. But the seventh day is a Sabbath day to the Lord our God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. And I want you to hear that sort of like the way that falls down, the way that moves down the chain. So it's not only that you are not supposed to work or that we are supposed to rest, but those who serve us are also supposed to have those days to rest. Even down to the animals. Do you hear the concern that God has even for the animals? Even animals can't go 7 days a week. They need a break. But listen to this, to God's activity. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. So there's this idea of like, if God could do all of creation in 6 days and then rest, you can do your work in 6 days because your work is much less than the work of creation, and you can rest on the seventh. We are made in his image and made to imitate his activity and love. I don't necessarily need a show of hands, but let's do that. How many of you have seen the original Rocky movie, the first one? Okay, if you've seen that movie, you recall the raw egg scene. Everyone does. Rocky wakes up in his kind of dreary, sad-looking room, and he goes to the fridge. First thing he does, goes to the fridge. He's not dressed very appropriately right then, but he goes to the fridge, takes out a cup, cracks 6 eggs into it, and drinks down the 6 raw eggs. I did a little research on this. Do you know how many people started drinking raw eggs after the Rocky movie came out? It actually gave rise to all these forums about how to consume raw eggs healthily and safely, and the benefits of raw eggs because it's going to make you a boxer like Rocky. I mean, but this whole idea, it's like that was a fake thing. That was a movie. It wasn't even a real person. And yet it inspired a whole generation of people my age to at least try to gag down a raw egg or two from time to time. Because that's our hero. How much more so if we're talking about God, the God of the universe, who's truly our God, if he is our fortress and our deliverer, our lover, our redeemer, our sovereign, then we should imitate and honor him. And this is one of the ways he's invited us to do it. He said, imitate me in keeping the Sabbath. Because this is what I do. And this is who I am. The second reason for why we should observe the Sabbath, take a deep breath, because we need it. This is one of those commands that is a blessing to obey because we need it. It acknowledges our human limitations. It's an act of admitting that we are not supermen, that we are not infallible, that we cannot sustain never-ending stress without consequence. And this is something all of us already know at the core of our being. Now, there are some of us who are more naturally blessed with energy. It's true. And those may be able to go full speed for weeks, maybe months, but even they will eventually run down and burn out. And in writing on the Sabbath, author Wayne Muller says this. Listen to this quote. If we do not allow for a rhythm of rest in our overly busy lives, illness becomes our Sabbath. Our pneumonia, our cancer, our heart attack, our accidents create Sabbath for us. If we will acknowledge our need for rest and worship and keep that need central, God will honor and bless us by meeting with us and strengthening us. Now, friends, please hear me. That quote that I just shared, that does not mean that everyone who is sick or anyone who has cancer, that it's a judgment from God because he has not kept the Sabbath. That's not what I'm saying. But the principle is that our bodies and our souls and our minds need the rest. And if we ignore that need, if we ignore the way that God has made us, there are consequences. Observing the Sabbath acknowledges God as the only sovereign, the only God, the only King, and our resting in him delights him and will delight us. It gives us the opportunity to enjoy him, his people, and his good gifts. We need it. So, here's the application. You ready for it? It's really profound. Try it. I want to challenge all of us to try out a Sabbath. I'm not going to be legalistic about it, but I want to give you a template, a suggestion. Remember what I said at the beginning about building the airplane and realizing I really don't have any idea of how to do this? Then let me make a suggestion for you as how, as individuals and families, we could experience and observe a Sabbath. For those who work 6 days a week, so your job is 6 days a week and you have a folga or a day off that maybe floats around, I'll give you another suggestion at the end. But to begin with, I want to address those who work Monday through Friday. Start by choosing a Sunday. Maybe a Sunday that's even a week or two away. Because I suggest Sunday because it already has worship built into it. You know, if you're here this morning, it means that at some level, your Sunday already has the concept of worship in it. And that's what we're doing this morning. We're here in the presence of God to worship. Set that Sunday apart ahead of time. Even write it on the calendar. That's from another generation, isn't it? Write it on the calendar. Write it on the calendar. Pray over it. No, just tell the Lord. It doesn't have to be a big ceremony, but pray over it with your family or with your spouse or alone, and just say, Lord, I'm going to give, this day is for you. That's a Sabbath, and I'm going to experience that Sabbath with you. Then prepare for it. Be intentional. Make lists if you want to. My wife can't prepare for anything unless she makes a list. It's one of her favorite activities. Figure out everything you need to do ahead of time so you can be at peace and rest on that day. Use the Saturday before it to buy the groceries that you need, to plan your meals, to clean your house, do laundry, and be ready. And let me suggest that you plan meals that you enjoy. Okay? Plan meals that you enjoy. It's not a day for liver and spinach only. Then prepare for it. Prepare for it. And when the Saturday before that Sunday comes, around 6 in the evening, begin your Sabbath and mark it intentionally. So if you are part of a family, gather the family, around that time to pray together and celebrate the beginning of Sabbath. Be intentional about it, okay? Family, we're starting. This is it. Our Sabbath is beginning. Let's pray. Let's commit it to the Lord. Then enjoy the evening. Again, have a good meal. Do something restful. I don't know what's restful for you and your family, but for us, we enjoy playing games together. Play a board game or a table game. Read a book. And make it a short evening. In other words, go to bed early. And again, I'm not being legalistic about what time that is. Again, Anderson early, Fawcett early, two different things. Two different things. And that's okay. But you know yourself and you know your body. Go to bed early enough so that you can awaken on Sunday morning refreshed. And so you can awaken early enough that you're not rushed to get to church. Let's be honest, nothing kills the Sabbath like being late for church. And everyone in the family is irritated with everybody else because everyone else is late, and this person got up too late, and that person took too long in the shower, and that person didn't clean up the kitchen, and this person didn't do that, and that person forgot their shoes, and so didn't do what they were supposed to do to get the littlest one ready, and then plan. Come to church. Worship the Lord. Enjoy your brothers and sisters. and go home. Plan in advance if you're going to have lunch alone or with friends or with family, and enjoy a good lunch for which you've prepared in advance. Enjoy conversation, relaxation, and whatever activity or lack of activity energizes and restores you. Last week I had someone ask me, do you think that a Sunday afternoon nap counts as keeping the Sabbath? And I said, absolutely. Absolutely. I encourage you, again, this isn't a question of legalism, but I encourage you in your Sabbath to keep screen time to a minimum. Whether that's small screen or big screen. But again, that's not a legalistic point. That's a suggestion. Enjoy the afternoon. Rest. Relax. Enjoy God and His good gifts. Enjoy your family. And I know for some of you that have small children, you're like, you are clearly no longer in my era of life. And I understand that. I understand that young kids make this a whole different blessing. It's a whole different kind of blessing. But that doesn't mean that we still can't be intentional about doing what we can to change the rhythm of our life on that day. And when sundown comes on that Sunday, and then if there are things that you still need to do to prepare for the week to come, begin at that time. Friends, keeping the Sabbath is going to mean saying no to some things. We can't say yes to everything. In fact, someone, I think it was my wife, said to me this week that she read somewhere that every time we say yes, we're actually saying no as well. When we say yes to something, it implies that we're saying no to other things. Now, let me suggest those of you who only have one day off, who don't have the luxury of Saturday and Sunday, let me paint perhaps another picture for you, that your Sabbath may be half a day. So the night before your day off, the night before your folga, do the same thing intentionally. Go to bed early, rest, and then on your day off, get up. Doesn't have to be at 5 o'clock, but get up on the earlier side. Use the morning of that day to accomplish the things that you need to accomplish, because there are things of the upkeep of the home or shopping or things, whatever. And then by early to mid-afternoon, stop, be at home, or be intentional and rest, and set apart the afternoon and evening for your Sabbath. Friends, could it be that we have missed out on some of God's great blessing by ignoring this great gift? Try it. You might find out that you like yogurt after all. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, you have offered us a gift of rest. And I pray that you would give us the wisdom to receive that gift. Meet us, Lord, in the practicalities. And even in the practicalities, give us discipline to say no when we need to say no, to plan when we need to plan. And Lord, I pray that we would not judge others by how they do or do not keep their Sabbath. But would you welcome us into your presence and into your rest? In Christ's name.